Dare to Defy Part 6, Parallel World Book 3, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Chapter 60. Someone took the IV out of my arm and helped me get out of bed. I felt pretty good, especially knowing I was free, and after I put my shoes on, I followed Billy out of the room. We seemed to be in a large house. We walked down a hallway, then up some stairs, and stopped in a room that was obviously an office. As soon as we entered, a tall man with a bald head came out from behind the desk. "You must be Morgan." His smile was warm and welcoming. "I'm Nick." "Hi." "I'm so glad you made it here in one piece." "Me too." I looked at the kindness in his eyes, and a strong feeling of gratitude swept over me. "Thank you for getting me out of there." He chuckled. "From what I heard, you got yourself out of there." "Yeah," I said, "but without Mills, I might have been recaptured." He waved his hand. "The important thing is that you're here now." He pointed to a small leather couch. "Please, have a seat." Billy and I sat down, and Nick sat in an adjoining chair. He asked me about my experiences in both Camp Willowmoss and Camp Stonewater. Though it was painful to relive some things that had happened, particularly the interrogation the day before, I answered his questions as much as I could. I wanted to help these people stop what was happening, and if my experiences could do anything to help, then I was glad to share. "I'm especially interested in watching the video you recorded, Morgan. How would you feel about watching it with me? I might have questions for you, and it would be helpful if you were here." Although I wasn't eager to relive the bad things that had happened, I was willing to do what I could to help. "Sure, I guess." He smiled. "Good. My tech people have gotten everything ready for us in the main room. It will be just the three of us." Billy and I followed Nick out of the office and into a room with a pair of couches and several chairs. A large television was mounted to the wall. After we were seated, Billy sat next to me on one couch, and Nick sat in one of the chairs. Nick picked up a remote and turned on the television. After a moment, the video I'd taken filled the screen. The first video was my meeting with Mrs. Reynolds. "She was your caseworker?" Billy asked with a grimace. "Yep." "That sucks." It felt so good to be sitting next to my best friend. He was the only person in this world who knew my deepest, darkest secrets, yet he still cared about me. I'd missed him so much, but now that I understood why he'd left Jack's place, I felt so much better about him. We watched the interaction I'd had with Mrs. Reynolds. "She's a bitter woman," Nick said. I laughed. That was an understatement. Next was a brief but humiliating interaction I'd had with Austin in the gym. He'd implied that I was fat and had laughed at me. My face reddened. Then a warm hand slid into mine and our fingers intertwined. I glanced shyly at Billy and he smiled. I smiled back, then quickly looked at the screen, a feeling of elation wrapping around me like a soft blanket. The next video showed Austin harassing Amy until Amy screamed how much she hated me. Though she and I had gotten past that, my heart still dropped when I heard her say those words. Then Amy told Austin she hated him, and moments later, Hanson was hitting her legs with his baton. Then she was forced to apologize for saying she hated Austin. "Oh wow," Nick said, clearly shocked. "That's disturbing." I thought about the torture I'd endured the day before and thought, that's nothing. The next clip showed Hanson bothering me at dinner, but the more interesting clip was the one after that, when Lori was forced to confess why she was there. Right after Lori said it was my record she'd falsified, Nick paused the video and turned to me. "Did you know about this?" I shook my head. "No. And watching it just now, I think Mrs. Reynolds knew I was really Morgan, and she wanted me to know what Lori had done." "Why would she want to do that?" Billy asked. He never let go of my hand, which thrilled me. "I don't know. She probably just wanted me to hate Lori." I looked at Nick, then back at Billy. "Lori was my roommate." "No kidding?" Billy asked. "No. You can imagine how surprised I was when she walked in." I turned to Nick. "Just see what happens next." Nick pressed the play button, and the video continued. It showed Amy yelling at Lori for what she had done, then launching herself at Lori and the two of them fighting. Though I didn't like seeing my sister in a fight, I had to admit that I was proud of her for standing up for herself. She'd been so bullied and abused at Camp Willowmoss, I was glad they hadn't broken her. As I thought about Amy and my family, sudden alarm pulsed through me. "Nick, can you stop for a second?" He pressed the pause button and turned to me. "I'm worried about my family. Last time I escaped, they locked up my sister. What do you think they'll do now?" He thought for a moment, then said, "We can move them to a safe place. From what I've seen so far on this video, when we release this to the world, it will go a long way toward changing people's minds. The least we can do is protect you and your family." The feeling of alarm settled a bit. "Can you get them soon?" "Of course. Please excuse me for a minute." He left the room, and Billy and I were alone. Chapter 61. "Nick seems like a good guy," I said. "Yeah, I really like him." Billy didn't seem uncomfortable with holding my hand, so I just enjoyed it. "It sucks what you had to go through," he said. "I know, but I got Amy out, and that's why I did it." "But you almost didn't get yourself out. What would you have done then?" I didn't really want to think about that. The possibility of being stuck in this world had been a very real threat. I'd even come to the conclusion that it was inevitable. "I don't know," I said. "I can't think about that now." Lost in our own thoughts, we sat quietly until Nick came back in the room. "I've made arrangements for my people to collect your family in the next few hours and take them to a safe place." "Thank you so much." I would feel better once I knew they were safe, but now that the wheels were in motion, I didn't worry quite as much. "Shall we continue?" Nick asked, before resuming the video. The next section was the lie detector test. As it began, it seemed innocuous enough, but I knew what was coming, and I tensed, waiting for the big reveal when Mrs. Reynolds would state my true identity. When it came, I heard Nick gasp. Soon, the screen showed the walls of the concrete cell, and just before the clip ended, I could clearly be heard saying in a shaky voice, "If you can hear me, please come and get me right away." Billy didn't say anything. He just let go of my hand, then put his arms around me and pulled me close. Nick paused the video and looked at me. "Who were you talking to when you said that, Morgan?" "Jack and Danny told me they might be able to see the video through the Wi-Fi at Camp Willowmoss, so I was hoping they would get the message." I wondered if they'd gotten any of it. I turned to Billy, who, to my delight, was sitting very close to me. "Do you have any idea if they were able to get this?" He shook his head. "What about you, Nick? Do you know?" "I haven't seen any of this online," he said, "and my guys are very on top of that sort of thing, so I can only assume they weren't able to hack into the Wi-Fi there." I was glad the enforcers hadn't taken my glasses away, and I was glad I'd kept filming, even though I wasn't sure if it would be worthwhile. Nick pressed the play button. The video showed Holly walking into my room at Camp Stonewater. When I saw her, I stiffened. Billy must have noticed my reaction because he pulled me closer. Feeling his strong arms around me made me feel safe, and I relaxed. Holly was bargaining with me, trying to convince me to cooperate. I glanced at Nick. He was riveted by the conversation on the screen. Not surprising, considering Holly was talking about ending the resistance once and for all. The video then cut to Holly coming back and me telling her that I wasn't going to give her any information. That's when the enforcers and the woman in the lab coat entered the room. I'd tried to run, but they'd easily overpowered me and injected the torture device into the base of my skull. Billy's arm tightened around me as we watched the events from my point of view. Finally, it was over, and you could hear the group leaving as I lay motionless on the bed. I knew the last segment would be the hardest of all to watch, and I braced myself for what was about to come. I told Holly my final decision was to not tell her anything. Then Mills and another enforcer entered the room. As I watched Mills on the screen, I tried to see if I could tell what he was feeling, but he kept his face expressionless as he went about his job, holding me still while his partner bound my hands behind my back. Soon I was in the interrogation room. The video showed the blank wall as I stared forward, waiting. I waited a while, I told Nick, and he pressed the fast-forward button until Fred and Holly entered the room and sat across from me. They began their questioning, and I didn't speak, but then Holly tapped the screen on her device. You could hear me screaming, and the camera went to a crazy angle as I slid to the floor and my glasses fell off. Billy shifted in the seat next to me, obviously upset by what he was watching. Though I had only experienced it the day before, I felt oddly detached, and instead watched it through the eyes of Nick and Billy. It had to be horrifying for them. Finally, Holly released the button and my screaming stopped. "Holy crap, Morgan!" Billy jumped up and walked to the end of the couch. Then he turned to me. "Mills didn't tell me it was this bad." I didn't know what to say. I looked down, then back at the screen. I could see Mills' hands in the frame as he placed the glasses back on my face. Now I knew that he must have known I could be recording the interrogation, and he wanted to make sure the glasses were on my face. "How many times did they do that?" Billy asked. "Just 2 more. It was the first time I'd seen him lose his cool." "Just 2 more," he echoed in disbelief. He sat beside me, but instead of putting his arm around me, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. On the screen, Fred asked me where Billy and I had gotten Jack's number, and when I didn't give Mrs. Duncan's name, Holly tapped her device, and my screaming began. Billy leapt from the couch and stormed to the back of it, pounding on it, clearly upset by what he was seeing. He stayed back there as the video showed Fred's face as he listened to me telling him how Billy and I had gotten a ride from Bryn. Then Fred asked me the name of the girl who had given us a ride, and when I said I didn't know, he said he didn't believe me, and Holly tapped the device again. My screams of agony were unmistakable, and as the picture started to shift as I slid to the floor, I was set back in my chair, and a few moments later the screaming stopped. "I'll kill him," Billy growled. "I'll kill Mills." Nick paused the video and turned to Billy. "You know it's not his fault." Billy glared at Nick. "He just stood there." I knew exactly how Billy felt, but I was over it. I understood why Mills couldn't step in. If he had, and his cover had been blown, some other enforcer would have chased me down, and when that enforcer had caught up with me, he surely wouldn't have let me go. I said as much to Billy, and he seemed to settle down. He stared at the back of the couch for a moment, then he came back and sat beside me, which made me happy. He put his arm around me, and when he whispered in my ear, his voice broke. "I just can't stand to see you suffering like that." I leaned my head against his shoulder. Nick pressed the play button once more. You could hear me telling them Bryn's name, then sobbing that I didn't know her last name. A few moments later, Holly and Fred left, then Holly came back and told me we were going on a field trip the next morning. A short time later, the screen showed my face, defeated and pale, as I stared in the mirror in my room. Then, in a tear-filled voice, I said, "I'm so sorry I wasn't stronger." The screen went blank. Billy put both of his arms around me and held me. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Don't ever be sorry for what you did." I still felt ashamed that I hadn't been stronger, that I hadn't been able to resist their torture, but Billy's words helped to assuage some of that guilt, and knowing they hadn't captured Bryn helped a lot too. "We'll edit the video to remove that section I forwarded through," Nick said, "and then we'll release it online by this evening." He smiled. "I'm proud of you, Morgan. You withstood a lot." His words warmed me. "Do you think when people see this it will change their minds?" He laughed. "Oh yeah, there's some pretty intense stuff in there. When it's all together like that, one incident after another, it's powerful." Happier than I'd been in weeks, I snuggled close to Billy. Chapter 62. Nick left the room, and Billy and I sat quietly on the couch for a while. As much as I relished Billy's attention, it was new. He'd never shown affection like this before, and I wondered what had changed. I'd been through so much, but I still felt shy asking him how he felt. But I had to. If all went as I hoped, I would be out of this world and back in my world in 2 days. Would Billy come with me? I needed to talk to him about it now, while things were calm and quiet. I pulled away and turned to him. He looked at me and smiled, which lifted my heart. "I'm so glad you're okay," he said. My smile grew. "Me too." I closed my eyes, then opened them to see him watching me. "Just this morning," I said, "I've been resigned to never getting home, and I don't just mean home in this world." He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. "Listen, I know you don't believe my story. Maybe you even think I'm nuts, but it's true." He grinned. "I don't think you're nuts, Morgan, but you have to know how crazy you sound when you say you're from a parallel universe." "What are you saying? Do you believe me or not?" He laughed softly. "I'm holding my judgment in reserve." "Fair enough, I guess." I stared at him for a moment. "But what if what I'm saying is true, and it is? Are you going to come with me? Back to my home?" He stared past me for a minute, then focused back on me. "I really like working with Nick, and I believe in what he's doing. I've never had a purpose before, Morgan, but I feel like I have one now. That's important to me. I matter here." Keen disappointment shot through me. He wouldn't be coming with me. I looked at my lap, then back at him, a forced smile of support on my face. "That's great, Billy. I'm happy you found your calling." He looked relieved. "I'm glad you think so, because you should join our group." Was this why he was being so affectionate? Because he thought there was a chance I would stay here and be part of Nick's group? I opened my mouth to speak, but then closed it as my mind whirled. I had a purpose here too, but did I want to live in this world? I'd been so focused on getting back to my home world that I'd never stopped to consider choosing to stay here. I leaned against the couch cushions and stared at the screen where a short time before we'd listened to me being tortured. If I stayed here, that could happen again. The enforcers could capture me and take me back to Camp Stonewater and keep me there forever. If I went back to my world, that threat would be eliminated. But what about the other Morgan? When I arrived back in my home world, she would be thrust back here, and she would be in immediate danger and wouldn't even know it. That wasn't fair either. But it wasn't my fault that I ended up here. I hadn't known that tunnel was actually some kind of wormhole to an alternate reality. But it was my fault that I'd screwed up so badly. I hadn't taken the laws here seriously, and then I'd made an enemy out of Lori, who had falsified records to get me hauled off to Camp Willowmoss. I looked at Billy, whose eyebrows were raised in question. I softly exhaled. "I don't know." His expression faltered a bit, then he took my hand. "Morgan, after all you've been through, you would be a huge asset to Nick's group. You have knowledge that no one else has. You've been inside one of their prisons." "I was mostly kept in my room, so I don't know that much about the rest of the place." I paused. "Except for the interrogation room and the rec room." I looked at Billy with incredulity. "Did you know that the kids there have a room where they play ping pong and air hockey? Why didn't they have that at Camp Willowmoss?" Billy laughed. "Oh yeah, Mills told me how they set that up for you." "Set that up for me? What do you mean?" "Mills told me that to persuade you to cooperate, they set up that rec room and brought in some kids from who knows where to come in and pretend like they lived at Camp Stonewater and got to hang out in this rec room so it would look like fun." "Really? They did all that just to trick me?" "Yeah. I guess it's not too often they capture someone who is so involved with the resistance groups. They were pretty desperate to get information out of you. I mean, can you imagine if they tracked down Jack and Danny? Those two probably know a lot of information that could be harmful to other resistance groups." "I know. That's what I was worried about, too. That's why I tried so hard not to tell them anything." He gazed into my eyes. "You did good, Morgan. No one could have withstood what you did and not say anything." His words made me feel better about giving up some information. "Did you notice that they believed me when I said I didn't know the name of the woman who gave us the phone numbers?" "Yeah, that was pretty awesome." "I just couldn't give them Mrs. Duncan's name." Then something occurred to me. "But what about the motorcycle? If the enforcers got it, which they must have since we left it at that guy Tyler's house, wouldn't they know it was taken from her?" "It would have been registered to her son, and he didn't know anything about us. But I think Mrs. Duncan is savvy enough to claim it was stolen." "I hope so. I wouldn't want to drag her into this." He looked down, then back at me. "So, what about it? Will you join our group?" I knew what my answer had to be. "Billy, I can't. I want to get back to my family and my world." He let go of my hand and sighed. You don't even know if you can get back." "Don't say that. I have to get back." He looked away, then back at me. "Morgan, I need you. Please, I want you to stay." His words shocked me. He'd never professed anything besides friendship before. I shook my head in confusion. "What are you saying, Billy?" He clenched his jaw, then stared right at me. "When Danny forced me to leave, and I knew it was possible I'd never see you again, it made me realize how much I'd come to care about you. And then last week when I saw the press conference with Tasco, and I saw you sitting there, chained to that chair, then taken away to Camp Stonewater, I almost went crazy with worry. Nick had to physically restrain me to keep me from going after you. I'm glad he talked some sense into me, though, because it wouldn't have done either of us any good for me to show up at Camp Stonewater to try to get you out. That was when Nick told me he had already talked to Mills about doing what he could to get you out of there." I was overwhelmed to know how much Billy cared about me. I'd missed him terribly, but it had never occurred to me that he was thinking about me too. Billy took my hand and his voice softened. "Morgan, you're my best friend." His best friend? I thought I'd felt vibes that it was more than that. Disappointment settled in my heart as I looked at him. I liked him a lot more than just a friend. He must have seen the look on my face because his smile grew. "But after all that's happened, my feelings run much deeper than friendship." The earnestness on his face intensified. "That's why I want you here, with me." He leaned closer. "Stay, Morgan. Stay with me." Overwhelming desire crashed over me. Desire to have Billy in my life. Desire to go home. Why couldn't he just come with me? Then he reached out and gently placed his hand on the back of my neck, avoiding the place where the torture device had been cut out. As he leaned toward me, he held my head still. I looked into his eyes as he bent close, then I tilted my face toward his. His lips touched mine. An explosion of feeling cascaded through me. His other hand slid around my waist, and he pulled me close. I wrapped my arms around his neck, loving the feelings he evoked in me. When he pulled away, I was breathless. He smiled. "Wow." Thrilled he felt the same way, I grinned. "So, will you stay?" he asked. "I have a better idea. Come with me. I want you to be in my world, Billy." His mouth tightened and he turned away. Then he looked at me with fervor. "I can't, Morgan. I'm needed here." Tears filled my eyes. "But I need you. You're my best friend." He sighed and pulled me into his arms. I kept the tears at bay, but I had lost him. After what he'd gone through in his life, his parents kicking him out, then betraying him, he'd been adrift. Now, belonging to Nick's group, he had an anchor, a purpose. It gave his life meaning. I couldn't expect him to leave that behind for me in an unknown world. But I couldn't give up the life I'd known just to be with him either. Although I believed in what Nick and his group were doing, I also believed that my purpose was in the world I'd come from. I had to go back to discover what that purpose was. We sat on the couch, his arms around me and my head tucked against his chest, and I drank in the moment, knowing it would end in 2 days. Chapter 63. "My tech people have put the video online," Nick said as he came into the room. Billy and I pulled apart and turned to him. "What about my family?" I asked. "They've been picked up and they're on their way to a safe place. Do you want me to arrange for you to go there?" "Yes, I'd like to see them." "Great. We'll leave in half an hour." Then he turned and left the room. I looked at Billy. "Do you think the video will have as much of an impact as Nick seems to think it will?" "I hope so. People's eyes will be open to what the government is really doing and to the lengths they're willing to go. It'll be a rude awakening for the people who have refused to believe there's anything bad going on at the F.A.T centers." An idea occurred to me. "Billy, if the video is going to make that much of a difference, then you can come with me." I sat up straight, a broad smile on my face. "I know there's still a lot you can do to help Nick, but if people start changing their minds, then there will be less for you to do, right?" He smiled, but it seemed sad. "Morgan, you don't understand. I want to be here, in this world. It's where I belong." "And you belong in your world." A knot formed in my throat. So now you're saying you believe I'm from another world? He laughed. I guess we'll find out soon enough. I swallowed several times, trying to push the knot out of my throat. Will you help me get to the tunnel? Yeah, I'll do everything I can to help you. That was all I could reasonably expect from him. Thank you. Billy stayed at Nick's place while Nick took me to see my family. It was wonderful to see all of them, although Mom and Dad were worried about having to be in hiding. It may not have to be for as long as you think, Nick told Dad. Why is that? Dad asked, his arm around me. The video your daughter provided, showing how she was treated, has been put online. I'm confident it will change the minds of a lot of people. Dad smiled at me. I can attest to the way things work at the F.A.T centers. They are not pleasant places to be. I spent the rest of the evening with my family, loving every minute of their company, but eventually it was time to leave. I explained to Mom and Dad that I had some things to take care of at Nick's place, but that I would be back soon. We said our goodbyes, and Nick brought me back to his house. Once we arrived, he showed me to the room where I would be sleeping. You're welcome to stay here as long as you'd like, Morgan, he said. Thank you, I appreciate that. But actually, I have somewhere I need to go the day after tomorrow, so I won't be staying here for long. He nodded, though I could tell he was curious. Okay. He left, and I got ready for bed, putting on the pajamas that had been laid out for me. I looked out the bedroom window, happy that I didn't have to peer through thick bars to see outside, and enjoyed the view of the beautiful gardens that surrounded the house. I slept well that night, feeling safe and secure in this house that seemed isolated from reality. The next morning, Nick asked Billy and me to meet with him in his office. Wondering what news he might have, I walked with Billy down the hall and into the large book-lined room. Nick sat behind his desk, staring at a computer. When we walked in, he smiled. Come see this. He motioned for us to come around and look at the screen with him. I looked over his shoulder at the website he had up. It was the video that I had recorded on my camera. See how many views there are? Nick said, wonderment in his voice. It's gone viral already, and it's only been out since yesterday afternoon. He turned and smiled at me. What do you think about that? I think it's fantastic. What are people saying about it? Billy asked, focused on the effect it was having. I've read through some of the comments, Nick said. The theme seems to be how disgusted people are with what's happening. There are even some people who have posted that the same types of things happened to them, but they were warned not to tell anyone for fear of awful things happening to them or their families. Have any of the news outlets picked up on it yet? Billy asked. Not yet, but they can't ignore it for long. There's too much public outcry now. Satisfaction washed over me. What I had gone through had made a difference. Please have a seat, Nick asked us, and we sat on the couch across from his desk as we had the day before. Morgan, last night you told me that you're going somewhere tomorrow. Are you still planning on that? I glanced at Billy, who looked at me with a half-smile. Then I turned back to Nick. Yes, absolutely. Is it something you can postpone? I shook my head. No way, no. He sighed. Why? Billy asked Nick. What's wrong? With the release of this video, Nick said, and the reaction to it, the enforcers will be out looking for you, Morgan, and they'll be more determined than ever to capture you. My heart skipped a beat. After arriving at Nick's place and feeling so safe, I put the enforcers out of my mind. I'd somehow thought going to the tunnel would just be a formality to getting home. Billy lifted my hand and placed it in his. You should stay, Morgan. It's too risky. I yanked my hand away, angry at him for suggesting such a thing, although I knew he was right, at least about the risk. You know I can't. Confusion clouded Nick's face. Where is it you need to go? Why can't it wait? My gaze shot to Nick. I'm sorry, but I can't tell you. He seemed to accept that. After all, he lived in a world of secrets. Will you be alone? He asked. I'm going to take her there, Billy said, practically before Nick had finished asking. I held back a smile. Good, good, Nick said. Well, if you're determined to go, then there's nothing I can do to stop you. I was glad to hear that, because it hadn't occurred to me that he would try to stop me. Is there anything I can do to help you get to this mystery destination safely? He asked. Yes, actually. Billy grinned. Do you have a motorcycle I can borrow? Nick laughed. "I'm sure I can find one for you to use. Anything else?" "A few other things," I said. "Do you have a GPS device I can borrow?" "Of course. What else?" I glanced at Billy. "A hatchet and a couple of flashlights." Nick's eyebrows went up, and I could tell he was trying to hold back his questions. He looked at Billy, who nodded. Then Nick said, "Okay, is there anything else?" "Just a bit of food and water, and perhaps a backpack. And if I can use your computer for an hour or so." "Sounds like you're going on quite an adventure." "You have no idea," Billy said. I elbowed him in the side, and he laughed. "I'll see about getting the items you requested," Nick said, "and you can use my computer." He left then, and Billy and I spent the next hour pinpointing the GPS coordinates for the tunnel as well as the hut. With both of us searching, and having found them once before, it took less time to find everything this time. We wrote the coordinates down, ready to program them into the GPS device once Nick gave it to us. I also asked Nick if he knew a hairdresser who could come over and dye my hair back to its natural color. He invited a woman named Paula to come over. She was tall and had beautiful hair, and she seemed much more experienced than Bryn had been. First, she had to bleach the old dye out of my hair, then she added back a color that seemed close to my natural color. I looked in the mirror, and besides my hair being shorter, I looked a lot more like my old self. Billy and I spent the rest of the day hanging out and enjoying one another's company. Neither one of us tried to change the other's mind about going or staying. But when Nick handed me the backpack with the requested items, I not only felt the weight of the objects, but the weight of leaving. Once I went back through the wormhole or portal or whatever it was that had brought me here, I didn't think I'd be able to come back even if I wanted to. This wouldn't be see you later, it would be goodbye. Forever. Chapter 64. After telling Billy and Nick good night, I got ready for bed, climbed between the covers, and stared at the ceiling. I was so excited for morning to arrive and to finally be able to get home. My thoughts wandered, and I wondered how the actual transition into the other world would happen. I had no idea, but thoughts of that led me to thoughts of the other Morgan. I couldn't just let her show up in this world where enforcers were determined to catch her without giving her some kind of warning. I slipped out of bed and went to a desk tucked in a corner. It didn't take long to find a sheet of paper and a pen. I sat at the desk and wrote her a letter detailing all of the things that had happened to me since I'd gotten here. I even told her how it had happened. If I was her, I'd be curious. I laughed softly. I was her, just an alternate version. The letter was long, but I hoped it would keep her safe. I folded it into thirds and put it in an envelope, then sealed it and wrote her name on the front. I would give it to Billy and ask him to give it to her. When the switch happened, I assumed she would be at or near the house in Fox Run. Suddenly exhausted, I climbed into bed and slept soundly until morning. When the rays of the sun woke me, I was eager to get up and get going. After showering, I met Billy in the kitchen. "You still want to do this?" he asked as he ate. "You know I do." The anticipation and excitement had killed my appetite, but I managed to eat some fruit. It was just the two of us in the kitchen, so I pulled out the envelope and handed it to him. He took it and read the names scrawled across the front. He looked at me. "What's this for?" "After I get to the tunnel, I need you to look for the other Morgan." "Wait, who?" Since he didn't necessarily believe my story, it wasn't surprising that he'd never thought about the Morgan that came from this world. When I traveled through the portal or whatever it was and arrived in this world, the Morgan who came from this world disappeared. He looked at me like I had gone completely crazy, like maybe the torture Holly had put me through had pushed me over the edge. I smiled and rolled my eyes. I was perfectly sane. "Anyway, when I go back through the portal to where I came from, the other Morgan will most likely come back to this world, and she'll be in danger." He sat back like he was starting to get it. "I need you to find her, bring her back here, and give her this letter. It will explain everything." He laughed. "And you think she'll just willingly come with me? She'll have no idea who I am." I thought of that too. True, but she's got to know that something weird happened. She won't know how it happened, just that it did. That still doesn't solve my problem. How do I convince her to go with me? She knows how this world works. If you tell her that the enforcers are after her and that you need to get her to safety, hopefully she'll go with you. Why can't I just give her the letter first? That will explain everything. Worried that this wouldn't work, I sighed. It's kind of long. I don't like the idea of you guys sitting there where the enforcers can find you while she reads it. That brings up another question. Where am I going to find her? I think she'll be somewhere near my house in Fox Run. You remember that woman who screamed at us right after we got back from the hut? He nodded. That was my house. She's the one who moved in. Oh. Hopefully the other Morgan will be somewhere around there. You know you sound nuts, right? I rolled my eyes. Well, yeah, but that doesn't make it not true. I looked at him and he didn't seem convinced. Will you please just do this? He sighed. Sure, whatever. I knew the truth would be evident soon enough. Thank you, Billy. Before we left, I said goodbye to Nick. I thought about telling him I might be back later and I might look a little different. The other Morgan most likely still had long hair, but I decided it was just too complicated. Billy could handle that when it happened, since he would be here. As I thought about Billy staying in this world, something died in me. He was the only person in this world, or mine, who knew the truth. And once I crossed through the portal, I would never see him again. He was the only person who knew exactly what I had been through. He was my best friend, and was just starting to become something more, but all I would have of him were memories. Ready? Billy asked. I hefted the backpack over my shoulders and stared at him. Finally, I nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. We headed out to the driveway where a motorcycle waited. It wasn't as sleek-looking as the one we'd used before, but that didn't matter. We just needed something that would get us to Fox Run. We put on the helmets and climbed on the bike. Then Billy started it up, and off we went. Chapter 65. As we traveled, I kept an eye out for enforcers. I didn't think we stood out, but it still made me nervous to be in the open. An hour after we left Nick's place, we arrived at Fox Run. Billy knew the way, and before long we were parked down the street from my house. The neighborhood was quiet. We climbed off the motorcycle and took off our helmets. It's not too late to change your mind, Billy said as he set his helmet on the bike. This was what I'd been working toward ever since I'd arrived in this world, so changing my mind was not even a remote option. I looked at him and smiled, happy to be on the verge of getting home, but sad to have to tell him goodbye. I'm not going to change my mind, Billy. He sighed. Okay. I took the GPS device out of the backpack and held it up. Let's do this. Just like last time, it took an hour before we reached the tunnel. I couldn't believe we'd made it there so easily. We stood at the entrance and I was eager to go inside. I set the backpack on the ground and took out a flashlight. Did you hear that? Billy whispered as he turned his head to the side. I hadn't heard anything, but I'd been focused on the tunnel, so I hadn't really been listening. No. Then I heard a soft rustling. There it is again, he whispered. My eyebrows tugged together. Stay here, I'm going to check it out. I didn't like the idea of standing there by myself, but agreed to wait. Billy walked away, and after a moment he disappeared into the forest. I stared into the place where he'd gone, trying to see through the trees, but I saw nothing. I waited for nearly 10 minutes, and was just about to go after him when I heard a noise behind me. I spun around. Standing in front of me was Hansen. Look who showed up after all, he said with a grin, and to think they didn't believe me. The flashlight slipped from my hand as my whole body froze. What's wrong, Morgan? Surprised to see me? Wanting to scream, but unable to make my mouth work, I stared at him. Finally, I found my voice. Billy! I screamed. Hansen laughed, which sent a chill charging into my chest. He's a little tied up right now. Where is he? I frantically looked the way he'd gone. Don't worry about him. This is about you and me. We have a little unfinished business. How did you find this place? He grinned. It was thanks to you. The coordinates were programmed into the GPS that you left at Tyler's house. Remember him?" I nodded as I frantically tried to figure out what to do. I could run into the tunnel, but then two things could happen. One, Billy would be left to Hansen's mercy, or two, Hansen would follow me right into my world. Neither option was good. "Yeah," he said with a smile. "We came here and waited for you after that, but you never showed up. Everyone else gave up, but not me. As soon as I heard you'd gotten away from Camp Stonewater, I had a hunch you'd come here." "You're by yourself?" "I thought you would enjoy our meeting better if it was one-on-one." His lips twisted into a grin. "Just you and me." The look of anticipation on Hansen's face made me shudder with horror. I had no idea what he was going to do to me, but I knew it would most likely end in my death. I had to get away from him. I also needed to help Billy. He was only in this situation because he wanted to help me. I couldn't leave him now. I turned away from Hansen and bolted in the direction Billy had gone. I only hoped I could find him before Hansen caught up with me. "Where are you going, Morgan?" Hansen called after me. I heard his heavy footfalls as he began chasing me, but I ran into the trees that surrounded the opening to the tunnel, my heart pounding wildly in terror. "Billy!" I called out, but there was no response. Hansen was gaining on me. The same feeling of utter panic I'd felt when Mills had pulled me off of the fence 2 days before slid into me. Adrenaline dumped into my veins, giving me energy to run faster. I didn't see Billy anywhere, and my alarm grew. I had to slow Hansen down so I could look for Billy. I dashed behind a tree and pressed my back against the wide trunk as I desperately searched for something to defend myself with. If only I hadn't taken off the backpack, I could have used the hatchet. I heard Hansen's heavy breathing as he approached my hiding place. As the sound grew louder, I silently scooted around the trunk, concealing myself. He passed me, but didn't see me. That's when I saw a good-sized branch lying on the ground a few feet away. I peered around the trunk. Hansen was stopped about 30 feet away, his back to me. He turned his head from side to side, then he cupped his hands over his ears. "Morgan," he called out in a sing-song voice, come out, wherever you are." Shuddering with dread, I jerked back into place behind the trunk. My gaze went to the branch, but I was afraid he would turn around and see me just as I left the safety of the trunk to pick it up. I squeezed my eyes closed and listened intently. No sound came from his direction, which was almost worse than when he had called out to me. At least then his voice had given me an idea of where he was. With my heart pounding, I peered around the trunk again. He was gone. My eyes wide with fear, I straightened. Where was he? This wasn't like playing hide and seek with my brothers. This was like playing hunter and prey, and I was the prey. Gathering my courage, I squeezed my eyes closed. Then I opened them and focused on the branch. Moving as quickly as I could, I took 3 steps to reach it, then snatched it up. I hefted it in my hands. It would do. Then, as stealthily as I could, I darted from trunk to trunk, looking for Billy and keeping an eye out for Hansen. I avoided the place where Hansen had stopped. Somehow, it seemed like he would jump out from behind one of the trees in that spot. After 5 minutes of searching, although it seemed like hours, I heard a moan. On high alert, I tiptoed toward the sound. Billy was tied to a tree. Blood dripped from his mouth and nose, and his eyes were closed. He moaned again. Before revealing myself, I looked around to make sure the coast was clear. Just then, Hansen walked out from behind a nearby tree. I pressed myself against the tree I was hiding behind and held the branch against my chest. Hansen was to my right, but unless he walked in my direction, he wouldn't see me. "How are you doing, lover boy?" Hansen asked Billy. I peered around the trunk to see what was happening. Hansen was pushing against Billy's leg with his boot. "Looks like she left you to me. I guess she doesn't care about you after all." Billy's eyes opened and he glared at Hansen. Then he spit a wad of mucus and blood in Hansen's direction. Hansen slammed his fist into Billy's head, snapping it back against the tree trunk. Billy's head fell forward and he didn't move. "Did he kill him?" my mind screamed. "Did he just kill him right in front of me?" I watched as Hansen stood over Billy and began to laugh. Something about his laughter dug deep into my soul, and all the terrible things he had done to me flashed through my mind. Without conscious thought, I hurtled out from behind the tree, the thick branch raised over my shoulder like a baseball bat, and rushed toward Hansen. He must have heard me, because he turned in my direction in what seemed to be slow motion. He was much taller than me, so when I swung the branch at his head, it was only shoulder height. He threw up his arm to deflect the blow, but I'd swung it so hard that it put him off balance and he stumbled. I took advantage of his faltering step and quickly swung the branch at him again. This time it connected with a solid thwunk against his chest, and he fell backward, smacking his head hard against the ground. I raised the branch to hit him again, but when I looked down at him, he was unnaturally still, and blood was pooling under his head. Taking a closer look, I saw that he'd hit his head on a sharp rock. A large gash was clearly visible on the back of his head. A profuse amount of blood poured out of the wound. If he hadn't already died, he would very soon. I turned away from him and hurried over to Billy, whose head still hung limply. "Billy!" I cried out. "Billy, can you hear me?" I pressed my fingers to his neck and felt a strong pulse. I released a sharp breath of relief. I untied the ropes that kept his hands bound and gently, ever so gently, laid his head on the blanket of leaves that had settled around the tree trunk. After glancing at Hansen to make sure he hadn't moved, I stroked Billy's cheek. "Wake up, Billy! Wake up!" Chapter 66. After several long moments, Billy opened his eyes. "Morgan?" "I'm right here," I murmured. "Everything's going to be okay." He tried to sit up, but closed his eyes and fell back against the leaves. "You need to rest right now." He opened his eyes and looked past me. "Hansen?" I glanced at the body of the enforcer who had wanted to kill me. "I think he's dead." Billy lifted himself onto one elbow, grimacing, then looked in Hansen's direction. "You're not sure?" "I'm pretty sure. There's a lot of blood." "Make sure, will you?" I looked back at Hansen and shuddered, but Billy was right. I stood and walked over to Hansen and stared at his chalk-white face, then squatted beside him and pressed 2 fingers against his neck. There was nothing, not even a faint flutter. That, plus the large puddle of blood beneath his head, was all the confirmation I needed. I went back to Billy, who had pulled himself into a sitting position and was leaning against the tree. "He's dead." Billy smiled. "Good. But are any other enforcers around?" I shook my head. "I don't think so. When he confronted me at the tunnel, he pretty much said he was there by himself." "He ambushed me. But I just don't get how he knew to find us here. I know you didn't tell anyone." "Right. But he said he found the coordinates in the GPS device we had to leave at Tyler's house." "Ah, that makes sense." He stared at me for a second. "Thanks for coming back for me." I put a look of indignation on my face. "Did you really think I would leave you in his evil clutches?" Billy laughed. "I don't know. I know how eager you are to get into that tunnel." "That's true, but I didn't want him following me back to my world either." "Oh, I see. So it wasn't just for me that you came after him. You had your own agenda." I smiled. "That's right." He grinned and held his arms out, and I eagerly went into them. After a few minutes, he said, "Help me up." I stood, then reached out to him. He grabbed my hands and I pulled. A moment later, he was on his feet. "How do you feel?" "I have a headache, but other than that, I'm fine." "You should get to a doctor." He laughed. "Not a chance. They turned me in the moment they saw me." I knew he was right. "What about Nick? Can he help?" "He has medical people he uses, but that can wait. I feel okay. Right now we need to get you to that tunnel." He looked at me with hope clear on his face. "Unless you've changed your mind." More than ever, I wanted to be with him. "What about you?" I looked at him with undisguised pleading. "Come with me, Billy, please." He gazed at me, then he looked away. When our eyes met again, he reached out and stroked my cheek. "No, Morgan." He shook his head, making his statement final. "No." His unarguable pronouncement broke my heart, the intensity of the pain surprising me. Tears rushed to my eyes and I turned away, not wanting him to see how much his answer hurt. I continued walking forward, my back to him. Using all of my self-control, I kept my voice steady as I called out, "I'm going to get going." "Morgan, wait," he said, his voice quiet. But I continued on, embarrassed by my tears. I heard him following me, so I didn't turn around, and by the time I reached the tunnel entrance, my tears had stopped, and I'd gotten myself under control. Shrugging the backpack over my shoulders, I picked up the flashlight I dropped earlier and turned in his direction, then watched him walk the last few feet to the tunnel entrance. He held out his arms, but I shook my head. If I let him hold me, I wasn't sure I would be able to let him go. He looked hurt by my refusal, but I didn't let that sway me. "Thanks for being my friend," I said, a sad smile on my face. He nodded. "You too." There was really nothing left to say, so I lifted my hand and opened my fingers in a tiny wave, then let my hand drop to my side. He didn't make a move toward me. "Goodbye, Morgan." Not able to speak as my throat had closed up, I nodded once, then turned and walked into the dark tunnel. I turned on the flashlight, illuminating the earthen walls, and began walking forward. "Goodbye," I whispered. It was hard to see as I moved forward, not because of the dimness of the tunnel, but because of tears filling my eyes and streaming down my cheeks. I tried not to think about Billy, and instead focused on the matches lying on the ground. I thought about Hansen and the other enforcers, and wondered what they had thought when they'd followed the GPS coordinates and come across the tunnel. Had they gone inside? Of course they would have, especially if they thought Billy and I could be hiding in here. Had they gone to the end and found the hut? Obviously they hadn't crossed through the portal, or they wouldn't still be in this world. As I continued walking, I vividly recalled the last time I'd come here with Billy by my side, and the sharp disappointment I'd felt when I'd realized I was still in this world. As I considered the very same thing happening now, my stomach tightened. Maybe I was destined, doomed, to be trapped in this parallel universe forever. But then the beam of the flashlight glinted off something up ahead. I hurried forward, audibly gasping when I saw the lantern I dropped on the morning I'd arrived in this world. That hadn't been there when Billy and I had come through before. That could only mean I'd crossed the portal into my world. Indescribable joy infused every fiber of my being. I would soon be home. But the flip side was that I would never, never, ever see Billy again. Extreme sadness crashed over me like a wave. My one and only best friend was lost to me forever. The tears started again. Why was I such a baby? But they were a mix of sadness and joy. Before long, I reached the ladder. I looked up. The trapdoor was wide open. I hurried up the rungs and found myself in the familiar hut. My gaze shot to the door, which was crushed by a thick tree, further confirming that I had made it home. I shrugged off the backpack and took out the hatchet, then picked a place along the wall and started whacking the sharp blade against the wood. It was cold in the hut, but before long sweat streamed down my back. I hit and hit and hit, and finally a beam of light burst through a crack in the wood. After a few more hits, I made a hole large enough to climb through. I dropped the hatchet on the ground. I didn't want to have to explain to Mom and Dad why I had it. Then I picked up the backpack and climbed through the opening. My feet sunk in the ankle-deep snow, and I remembered how it had snowed on the night I had run away. Thinking about that now, I cringed at how immature I had been. Running away just because I thought life wasn't fair? I'd learned the meaning of what wasn't fair, and I had nearly lost everything I loved because of my impetuousness. Dumb, dumb, dumb. Well, I'd certainly learned my lesson. As I slowly spun around, I laughed with joy. I was home! I took off the backpack and pulled out the GPS device, then programmed in my home address. Once the satellite was acquired, I set off toward home. I thought about how I would explain my short hair. Thanks to Nick's friend Paula, at least I'd gotten it back to its natural color. As I walked, I noticed the pen marks slashed across tree trunks, and my grin widened. I only wished Billy was here to see them. Even though he'd helped me, deep down I knew he doubted my story. I tried not to think about the boy I cared so much about, and instead focused on getting home to my family. My family, The one constant through all of this had been the love of my family. Whether in this world or the one I just left, they had been there for me, and I knew they always would be. I smiled as I pictured each of their faces. I could hardly wait to reach home. Chapter 67. I kept one eye on the GPS device and one eye on the slash marks on the tree trunks, and before long the row of houses came into view. I picked out the back of my house and hurried toward it, but decided to approach from the front. When the picket fence came into view, my eyes were drawn to Goldie playing with my brothers in the front yard. My heart leapt with joy to see them. "Hi, guys," I said as I entered through the gate. They stopped playing and looked at me. "What happened to your hair?" Zach asked. "Do you like it?" I fluffed up my short hair and smiled. "It looks different," Brandon said. "Is Mom home?" I asked. "Yeah." "'Kay, see ya." They went back to playing, and I went into the house. The warmth of the living room embraced me, and I paused, drinking in the feelings of home. "Where have you been?" Mom asked from the kitchen doorway, fury clear on her face. "I've been searching for you all day." She paused. "And what did you do to your hair?" I let the backpack slide off of my shoulders and I ran to Mom, flinging myself into her arms. "I'm so sorry," I sobbed. She pulled away from me and looked at me with sternness. "I've been worried sick, Morgan. I even called the police. And Dad's been worried too. He took the whole day off looking for you, but he had to go into work for a while." "I was stupid. I ran away because I was mad." "Where did you go?" "Into the forest." Her eyebrows went up. "In this weather?" I got my tears under control and I wiped them away with my sleeve. "It wasn't snowing when I left." "Where did you sleep?" "I found a hut, but a tree fell on the door during the night and it took me a while to get out." Her gaze roamed over my face and stopped on my short tresses. "What happened to your hair?" "I cut it." She frowned. "I can see that." I didn't want to lie to her, but the truth was too incredible for belief. "You can ground me for as long as you want. I know I deserve it." She sighed. "We'll talk about that later. I'm just glad you're safe." Then she gave me a hug. "For now, I think you should go to your room and stay there." Thrilled to be home where I belonged, I nodded. I grabbed the backpack and ran up the stairs to my room. I set it on the floor, then slowly spun around, so happy to be home. "Hi, Morgan," Amy said from the doorway. "Amy!" I ran to her and threw my arms around her. "I'm so glad to see you." After I let her go, she wore a look of puzzlement. "Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm fantastic." Her face smoothed out and she smiled. Then she glanced behind her and looked at me. She dropped her voice to a whisper. "I didn't tell them about William." "William?" I asked. Then I remembered that on the night I ran away, I told her I was meeting a boy. She'd asked me what his name was, and when I'd seen the book she'd been holding, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, I told her the name of the boy I was meeting was William. As I realized that Billy was a nickname for William, I felt a jolt. "He actually goes by Billy." "And?" I smiled sadly. "It didn't work out." Her face fell. "That's too bad." I nodded, my joy in being home tempered by the knowledge I would never see Billy again. "Mom and Dad were so worried. I think you're in big trouble, Morgan, but I promise I won't tell them about Billy." Overwhelmed by so many emotions, tears filled my eyes, but I brushed them away. "Thanks, Amy. You're the best sister in the world." Obviously perplexed, because I'd never said anything like that to her before, her eyebrows tugged together. Then she smiled. "You're the best sister too, Morgan." I hugged her again, my joy in being home filling me with a warmth I'd never experienced before. Amy pulled away. "I have homework to do, but maybe later we can hang out?" Suddenly wanting to get to know my sister better, I nodded. "Yeah, let's hang out." Her face lit up. "Okay." Then she walked away, her shoulders back and her head held high. I turned to face my room and saw the mess of clothes and other items strewn around the room. I picked up the clothes and put them away, then I moved on to the rest of the mess, and slowly but surely my room began to look tidy. I took the vacuum out of the closet and wheeled it back to my room, then cleaned the carpet until it was spotless. After putting the vacuum away, I went into the bathroom and noticed it could use a good scrubbing. I got right to work, thinking how much easier this was than cleaning the 4 bathrooms at the F.A.T Center. I shook my head as I thought about the last 2 months. Now that I was home, it almost seemed like a dream. Bent over the toilet, I stood abruptly. Had it all been a dream? Had I just imagined it? I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My hair was still short. It had really happened. But being home now, after longing for it for so long, felt surreal. "Wow, Morgan, what a nice surprise." I turned to see Mom standing in the bathroom doorway. I hadn't done this to surprise her. I had just seen that it needed doing, so I did it. But making her happy was a nice bonus. "Hi, Mom." She narrowed her eyes at me. "You're still in trouble for running away, you know, and for getting suspended." I'd almost forgotten about my suspension for pushing Shelby. I still thought it was wrong, since I'd been standing up to a bully, but being suspended was a minor punishment compared to what I'd faced in the other world for my crimes. I smiled at Mom. "I know." She leaned against the door frame as she returned my smile. "But you do know how to soften me up, don't you?" My smile vanished. "I wasn't trying to soften you up, I promise." She laughed. "It's okay, we'll work it out." She paused. "I need to run some errands, and Dad's still at work, so I need you to watch your brothers for me." "Okay." Her eyebrows went up in surprise. "No sighing? No complaining? You really are working it." Had I really been that obnoxious and predictable? I thought back to how I was before. Yeah, I'd had my moments. I laughed. "Just trying to work my magic." She smiled. "It's kind of working." She straightened. "I'll be back later. Bye, Mom." After she walked away, I went back to scrubbing and soon finished. Since Mom seemed so happy about what I was doing, I decided to clean the rest of the house. First, I checked on my brothers. They were watching TV in the living room, so I got back to work. 2 hours later, the house sparkled. I was excited for Mom to get home so she could see what I'd done. "Morgan," Brandon said, "I'm hungry." As he said that, I realized I was famished. I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. I'd been so stressed and emotional that I hadn't even been hungry, but now it hit me hard. "I think Mom will be home soon, and then we'll have dinner." "But I'm hungry now," he whined. So was I. "Okay, let me call Mom and see when she'll be home." Her cell phone number was programmed into the kitchen phone, and after a brief conversation with her, I hung up. I turned to Brandon, who watched me expectantly. "She's not going to be home for a while, so she said we could go ahead and eat." "Yay!" he said. I took out Mom's recipe book and found one of my favorite recipes, lasagna. I made sure we had all the ingredients and got started. After what I'd been through, I was nothing short of amazed by the variety of food items we had in the kitchen. I was deep in thought as I mixed the meat with the tomato sauce when I heard a knock at the door. Immediately thinking about the enforcers who were after me, I froze. Could they have followed me into this world? Chapter 68. Brandon leapt from the couch and raced to the door. "Wait!" I screamed. He stopped in his tracks and stared at me, the urgency in my voice seeming to startle him. "It's dark out," I said, as if that was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the panic in my voice. And it wasn't completely unreasonable, but just out of character for me. "Let me get it," I said. A knock sounded again, this time more loudly. Brandon looked from me to the door and back to me again. I shook my head. "I've got it." His shoulders slumped and he trudged back to the couch. I hesitated, then walked calmly toward the door. It wouldn't do to show my brothers I was on the edge of freaking out. Amy came trotting down the stairs and asked, "Who's at the door?" I looked at her with wide eyes, as if I was trying to give her the message that we could be in danger. She looked back at me blankly. I had to remind myself that this Amy hadn't just been through hell. "Who is it?" she asked again, a perfectly reasonable question. "I don't know." She bounded to the door, saying, "There's only one way to find out," and before I could stop her, she swung the door open. When I saw his face, my mind began reeling. Which world was I in? "Hi," Amy said. He looked past her and right at me, a wide smile on his face. "Morgan?" My mind cleared and I knew where I was. "Billy!" I raced to the door and flung myself into his open embrace. "I can't believe you're here!" He laughed and wrapped his arms around me. "I can't believe it either." "This is Billy?" Amy asked. Reluctantly, I pulled away from him and turned to my sister. "Yes, Billy, this is my sister Amy." He played along like he'd never seen her before. "Hi there." "I'm Brandon," Brandon said as he materialized next to us, "and that's my brother Zach." Billy waved. "Hey, guys." I opened the door wider. "Come in." He glanced around. "Are your parents home?" I smiled. "No, Mom's running errands and Dad's at work." He seemed to relax. "Okay." He walked inside and I closed the door behind him. We stood there as I stared at him, trying to convince myself I wasn't dreaming. Then a thought occurred to me. "You're staying, right?" "He's going to stay for dinner?" Brandon asked with a grin. "Yay!" I looked at Billy and I could tell he knew what I meant. Staying in this world. He nodded. "Yeah, I am." "What changed your mind?" He glanced at Amy and my two brothers. Then he did a head gesture toward the kitchen. "Hey guys, Billy's going to help me in the kitchen. Can you let me talk to him alone?" Amy smiled and walked back upstairs. Brandon and Zach wandered back to the TV, and I took Billy's hand and pulled him into the kitchen. He looked at the ingredients spread out on the counter, then looked at me. "What are you making?" "Lasagna. Do you like lasagna?" "Never had it before." I smiled. "You're going to love it." I paused. "What happened after I left?" He leaned against the counter and chewed on his lip. "I guess I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not believing you." I smirked. "Yeah, you thought I was crazy." "Well, you gotta admit, it did sound kind of—" He spun his fingers around his ears. I gently shoved him, then went back to working on the lasagna. "So anyway, after you left, I jogged around to the hut, expecting you to come out." He chuckled. "I waited a while, and you never came out. That got me thinking, so then I went back to where we'd parked the motorcycle." His eyebrows rose. "Imagine my shock when I saw you walking out of the forest." He stood straight. "Well, it wasn't you. This girl looked like you did when I first met you. You know, long hair and all." My hands stilled on the spoon I was stirring and my eyes widened. My voice came out in a whisper. "The other Morgan." He nodded. "Yep, I was pretty shocked, I'll admit it." "What did you do?" "I did what you told me to do, and you were right. She knows how that world works, and as soon as I told her the enforcers were after her, she agreed to go with me. I took her to Nick's place. He was completely confused when she showed up, and I gave her the letter. While she was reading it, I told Nick the truth." "You did? What did he say?" "The proof was right in front of him, so he eventually believed me." "Then what?" "He promised to reunite you, with her family." He shook his head. "I think my brain's going to explode soon." I laughed. "Now you know how I've been feeling all along." "Yeah, I guess." He looked thoughtful. "After she read the letter, I asked her what she'd experienced." "What did she say?" "She said she'd been staying at some girl's cabin." "Yeah, Rochelle Candy's." He nodded. "Yeah, that's the name she said. Anyway, she said that she'd gone off by herself into the forest and that it was really weird. One minute it was warm and sunny and the ground was dry. Then the next minute it was cold and there was a bunch of snow on the ground." "Really?" I looked out the window at the snow covering the ground, then back at Billy. "It snowed the night I ran away, which was last night. And then the next morning I went through the tunnel and into your world. But when I arrived in your world, it was warm and sunny. When she switched places with me, I guess she ended up in the forest here, and it sounds like it was after it had snowed, which meant she arrived on November 10th, today." My eyes widened. "Was she only here for one day?" Billy smiled. "If you'd let me finish telling you what she said." I laughed. "Sorry, continue." "So anyway, she said she wandered around for a while kind of lost. I guess her sense of direction is as bad as yours. And then she saw some houses through the trees. She said as she walked toward them, she suddenly felt dizzy. She stopped and closed her eyes, waiting for the dizziness to pass. When she opened her eyes, the snow was gone. She kept walking toward the houses, and that's when I saw her and took her to Nick's place." "So she was only here for one day," I said. Then I shook my head. "When she had that dizziness, it must have been when I crossed back over, which made her cross back into her world. Yeah, I think so, especially since she said the snow disappeared. There was no snow on the ground today in my world. For some reason, when I crossed into your world, I went back 2 months, but for her it was just 1 day. Kind of like my family thinking it was just last night that I ran away, even though it's been more than 2 months that I've been gone. He grinned and nodded. I don't know how this parallel universe stuff works, but you have to admit it's pretty cool. I laughed. Yeah, except when you end up in some horrible world like the one you're from. I paused. What made you change your mind about coming here anyway? He looked away as he bit his lip, then he met my gaze. I have to be honest. I never really thought you'd end up in some other universe. I mean, last time you and I went through that tunnel, nothing happened, and I didn't want to encourage you, so I thought it would be best if I tried to convince you to stay. So you thought if you convinced the crazy girl to stay, she would eventually forget about where she came from. I see how this works. He looked chagrined. Yeah, something like that. He smiled. So anyway, once I figured out what you told me was true, I had to see for myself. What about Nick and his group? Don't they need you? I was worried that if Billy stayed here and felt he had no purpose, he might eventually resent me. Like you said, Morgan, that video is making a huge difference. I think they can get by without me. He leaned closer to me. Besides, who's going to help you figure out how to get around? My sense of direction isn't that bad. So now you don't need me? You think I should go back? Even though I knew he was joking, his words put me into a panic. I grabbed his arm. No, Billy, please don't leave me again. His features softened and he rubbed my back. Hey, it's okay. I'm not going anywhere. Relief swelled within me. Good. Then a thought occurred to me. What about the Billy in this world? Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing. I don't want to put him in danger. He'd be completely unequipped in that other world. He paused, looking thoughtful. I wonder if his parents were like mine were. Let's look him up online and see where he lives. I finished putting the lasagna together and slid it into the oven, then took Billy by the hand and brought him over to the computer. Chapter 69. We did a search on his name and were shocked when an article came up. Oh my gosh, I said as I pointed to the article. He's dead. We leaned closer to the screen as we read about the car accident that had killed Billy Foster a few days before. That is really weird, Billy said. He looked at me, his forehead crinkled in concern. Do you think that means I was meant to die? Do you think all this world changing somehow threw that off? I don't know. I guess it means the Billy from this world won't be sent to where he's being hunted. Yeah, that's good at least. I studied my best friend / maybe boyfriend and said, I guess that also means you can't be with your parents. It's not like they wanted me anyway. It could have been different in this world. I guess I'll never know. I'd love for you to live here, Billy, but I kind of doubt my parents would go for that. He smiled. Don't worry about it, Morgan. I'm sure I can figure it out. I'll be 18 soon enough, and in the meantime, I can take care of myself. But where will you live? As long as there aren't enforcers after me, I'm sure I can find a safe place to go. I smiled. No enforcers in this world. The front door opened, and Mom and Dad walked in. I jumped up from the computer and ran to Dad, throwing my arms around him. Morgan, he said, as he absorbed my weight. He hugged me back, then pulled away. Mom told me you were home, but I'm really disappointed in you. I can't believe you put us through all that worry. His words cut me to the bone as tears filled my eyes. I'm so sorry, Dad. I'll never, ever run away again. Ever, I promise. He turned to Billy, then looked at me, his eyebrows bunched. Dad, this is Billy Foster. Billy, this is my dad and Mom. Billy walked over to Dad and held out his hand. Dad shook it. Billy helped me, Dad. I was desperate for my parents to like him. He helped me get home. Dad looked between Billy and me. What do you mean? I was lost, in the forest. Billy found me and helped me get home. That was mostly true. Billy didn't find me in the forest, but if it wasn't for him, I wasn't sure I would have made it home. Dad smiled at Billy. Thank you for helping Morgan. Billy shook his head. I'm just glad she made it home safe." Dad seemed to believe my story. He nodded. "Me too." "Can Billy stay for dinner?" Brandon asked. Dad glanced at Brandon, then at Mom, who gave a slight nod. "Of course," he said. "It's the least we can do to thank him for helping Morgan get home." Billy helped me finish getting dinner ready. We tossed a salad and browned French bread. Then we all sat down to dinner. As we ate and talked, I was a little worried about Dad interrogating Billy since I'd never had a boy over for dinner before. But Dad didn't ask any awkward questions, and thankfully, neither did my brothers. "I like your parents," Billy told me as we washed the dishes. Normally, I wouldn't have volunteered to make dinner and clean up, but I figured it was the only way to talk to Billy privately. He wasn't allowed to go into my room, and it was too cold to sit outside. "Yeah, I kind of like them too. I just didn't realize it until I nearly lost them." "And that lasagna was delicious. I've never eaten such tasty lasagna." I laughed. "I thought you said you'd never even had lasagna before." He grinned. "True, but if I had, I'm sure it wouldn't have been that good." He rinsed off a plate and handed it to me, and I placed it in the dishwasher. "Hey, Morgan," Amy said as she walked into the kitchen. "Do you need any help?" Normally, I would have been irritated that she was interrupting. It wasn't every day that I had a boy over for dinner, but things were different now. I smiled at her and put my arm around her shoulder. "No, but thanks for asking." She smiled back. I thought about the way that Amy in the other world had leapt to defend me when Mrs. Reynolds had said I wasn't Hannah Jacobs. Even though she could have gotten into deep trouble, she hadn't hesitated. Warmth filled me at the memory, and my arm tightened around Amy's shoulder. "You know what, Amy? I think we should hang out more." Her face lit up. "Really?" I nodded. "Yes, you are my only sister." "Okay." Her voice showed her excitement. She glanced at Billy before looking back at me. "I have homework to do." Then she walked up the stairs. "You're lucky to have a sister you're close to," Billy said. "That's the thing. We're not close, but I plan to change that. After what I went through with her." His eyebrows shot up like he was saying, "It wasn't this Amy." I laughed. "You know what I mean. Anyway, now I realize it's dumb for me to tease her and be mean to her. She's the only sister I have." Just as we finished cleaning up, Mom came into the kitchen. "It's time for Billy to go home, Morgan." "Already?" "It's cool," Billy said to me. Then he turned to Mom. "Thanks for dinner, Mrs. Campbell." She smiled. "You're welcome. Thanks for helping Morgan get home." Panicked that once Billy walked out the door I would never see him again, I said, "Mom, Billy doesn't have anywhere to stay." Billy twisted in my direction, frowning. "Oh?" she said. He looked at her. "No, it's fine." Mom's eyes narrowed. "Where do you live?" Billy didn't know this area at all, so I wondered what he would come up with. We just moved here and I don't remember the address." Mom didn't seem to buy it. "Why don't you let Morgan's dad drive you home? It's awfully cold outside." Billy shook his head. "No, that's okay." Mom stared at him. "Tell me the truth. Do you have a place to stay tonight?" Billy's jaw clenched, then he shook his head. "Why not? Where's your family?" I was desperately trying to come up with a reason why Billy didn't have anywhere to go, an answer that wouldn't cause Mom to call Child Welfare Services or something, but Billy spoke first. "I'm not in contact with them." Mom's eyes narrowed. Never a good sign. "Morgan, what's going on here?" My composure began to slip as I stared at the floor and muttered, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Really?" It wasn't a question. I looked at Mom's face. Storm clouds were brewing. Any magic I'd worked earlier had lost its charm. "What if you told her the truth?" Billy said. Stunned, I stared at him. "Now there's an idea," Mom said as she smiled at Billy. "I think I like this boy." I cupped my hands over my nose and breathed out, "You won't believe me." Mom pulled my hands away from my face. "I have an idea. Wait here." She strode away, and I stared at Billy. "She'll lock me up if I tell her the truth. She'll think I'm absolutely insane." "You need to give your parents a chance." A moment later, Mom was back with Dad at her side. "Here's what we're going to do," Mom said. "Billy can tell Dad what he knows, and you and I will have our own talk." She smiled. "Okay?" I couldn't think of any other option, so I nodded. "Please follow me," Dad said to Billy. Billy took a step to follow Dad, then he turned to me. "Just tell the truth, Morgan." I nodded and watched them head for the stairs. "Boys," Mom said to Zach and Brandon, "please go upstairs and get ready for bed." They complained, but eventually headed up to their rooms. "Let's sit, Morgan." Chapter 70. I sat by Mom on the couch and she turned to me, her face expectant. I took a deep breath and dove in, telling her everything that had happened to me since the night I ran away. The night before to her, 2 months before for me. I had to admire her ability to keep her expression neutral as she listened to my story, although I saw glimmers of shock flash across her face from time to time. When I got to the part about being tortured, her calm expression changed to anger. I wasn't sure if she was mad at me because she thought I was lying or what, but I pressed on with my story, finally ending with getting home. When I finished, I sat back against the couch cushions, emotionally wrung out. She stared at me, then stared at the wall. "Let me see your neck," she said abruptly. I turned so the back of my neck was visible, and her fingers probed the spot where Nick's people had removed the torture object 2 days before. She said. "Now your arm." She pulled my right arm where she could see the place where the second chip had been cut out. The wound was small, though visible. She released my arm and looked at me. I couldn't tell what she was thinking. A few minutes later, Dad and Billy came downstairs. Mom stood and headed to Dad, while Billy came and sat by me. "We'll be back soon," Mom said, as she followed Dad upstairs. "How'd it go?" Billy asked me. "I'm not sure." I couldn't imagine what Mom was thinking, and I wished I could be a fly on the wall of their bedroom as they discussed what we told them. "What about you with my dad?" Billy laughed. "He's hard to read, but he didn't throw me out the window, so that's good, right?" I laughed. "Yeah, I guess so." Lost in our own thoughts, we sat there in silence. "Hey," I said, "I just thought of something." "What?" I grabbed his hand and dragged him with me upstairs to my room. "Should I be in here?" He looked around my room, and I was doubly glad I'd cleaned up earlier. "It's fine. I just have to get something." I went to the backpack that Nick had given me and unzipped the opening, then rummaged around until I found what I was looking for. I pulled it out and showed it to Billy. "Where did you get those?" "Nick put them in the backpack." Billy smiled. "That should help convince them." We rushed to Mom and Dad's bedroom and stopped outside the closed door. I pressed my ear to the wood, and although I could hear their voices, I couldn't make out what they were saying. Almost afraid to know what they were thinking, I tapped on the door. A few moments later, Dad opened it. He looked surprised to see us standing there. "I thought we told you to wait downstairs." "I have something to show you." He sighed, then held the door open. Billy and I walked in. Mom was sitting on the bed, but when we came in, she stood next to Dad. "Well?" he said. I held up the 2 power bars Nick had put in my backpack. They weren't the kind I'd had in the F.A.T centers. There were no drugs in these, just appetite suppressants. But these particular power bars didn't exist in this world. Mom and Dad each took one and examined them. Dad looked at Mom, his eyebrows raised. She shrugged. How were they able to communicate like that, without words? "I want to check something," Dad said. Then he left the room. We all followed him downstairs and watched as he sat in front of the computer and did a search on the power bars. There were no results. "Interesting," he muttered. "Do a search on me," Billy said as he took my hand. I smiled and squeezed his hand. Moments later, we were looking at a picture of Billy on the screen, only it said he had died. Dad spun around and looked at us. Mom stared at us too. "Your story is pretty incredible," Dad said. "I know. That's why I didn't want to tell you." "Thank you for telling us anyway," Dad said. He said it like he wasn't sure whether or not to believe it, and my heart dropped. "It's completely true." I looked between my parents. "You don't believe us, do you?" Dad sighed. "It's just a parallel world? You have to admit it's pretty improbable." Panic swelled within me. What if they refused to believe it? What would happen then? What would Billy do? Would he go back to his world? I had to get them to believe me. But what about the power bars and the scars on my neck and arm? I lifted my hair to show Dad where the torture device had been cut out. He stood and looked at my neck. Huh. Then he touched the healing wound. That's interesting, he murmured. I looked at him with pleading in my eyes. It really happened. It did. I believe you, Mom said. We all turned to stare at her, and hope swept over me. I went to her, and my voice came out in a whisper. You do? It's a crazy story, she said, but all the pieces fit. And even if you and Billy practiced your stories ahead of time, and there were so many matching details between your two stories that it seems pretty impossible for you to have made this up, I really feel like you're telling the truth, Morgan. Relief cascaded over me. She believed us. Then I turned to Dad. He frowned. I just don't know, Morgan. What can I do to prove it to you? I asked. He sighed. I don't know. I just need some time to digest what you and Billy told me. At least he hadn't rejected our stories outright. Okay. I hesitated. What about Billy? He doesn't have any place to go. Billy's face flushed. It's fine. I'm sure I can figure something out. Mom looked concerned, and she turned to Dad. Can we talk? He nodded, and the two of them went back upstairs. It's okay, Morgan, Billy said. Your dad's having a hard enough time believing our story. I can't ask him to take me in. But where will you go? It's cold outside. You can't just wander the streets. He smiled at me. I'm resourceful, remember? I shook my head. A few minutes later, Mom and Dad came back into the living room. I studied their faces. Dad didn't look very happy, but Mom seemed relieved. I hoped that meant they'd come to a decision I would like. Billy can stay here for a few days while we make other arrangements, Dad said. That wasn't exactly the answer I'd been hoping for. What other arrangements? I called a friend from work, and he may be willing to take Billy in. Mr. Campbell, Billy said, you don't have to do that. I can make my own way. I'm sure you can, Dad said, but you're not yet 18, so that's what we're going to do. Billy clenched his jaw like he didn't like being told what to do, but I grabbed his hand and squeezed it gently. It's for the best, I whispered, and he seemed to relax. Dad looked at Billy and me, then at our joined hands, then back at us. You two seem to like each other. A blush climbed my cheeks. He looked directly at Billy. Son, I'm going to warn you now. If anything inappropriate happens with my daughter, I'll kick you to the curb so fast your head will spin. Yes, sir, Billy said. Morgan, please get some blankets for Billy. He can sleep on the couch. Okay. I hurried upstairs to the linen closet to get a pillow and some blankets, then brought them back downstairs and set them on the couch. It's getting late, Mom said. It's time to settle in for the night. Okay, I said. Then Dad and Mom headed up the stairs. I turned to Billy. I'm sorry Dad won't let you stay here. We didn't think he would, remember? Anyway, everything will work out. He slowly grinned. I'm just glad I decided to follow you to this world. His words made me realize that it didn't matter what house he lived in. As long as he was in my world, everything would be okay. I knew what was most important, being with those I loved. Having Billy here just made everything all the sweeter. When I had been in his world, I told him how great it was here, and now he would be able to see it for himself. Not only see it, but experience it firsthand. I turned to him with a broad smile. He smiled back, then pulled me into his arms. I'm so glad you weren't just a crazy girl making up stories, Morgan. I pulled away, a look of mock indignation on my face. Shame on you for ever doubting me, Billy. He laughed softly. I'll never doubt you again. I put my hands on my hips. Good. He pulled me close, then moved his hands to my neck, tilting my face so that I looked him in the eye. I can't believe I almost let you go. My hand slid around his waist, and I relished the warmth of his closeness. I can't believe you're actually here. He smiled, his gaze focused on me. I'll always be by your side, Morgan. Always. He lowered his face toward mine, and our lips pressed together, and I felt the same explosion of feelings I'd felt the first time he kissed me. This was what paradise must feel like, being with the ones you love in a place where you feel safe, home. I was home. This has been Dare to Defy, Parallel World Book 3. Written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2013 by Christine Kersey. There are 2 follow-up books to the trilogy you finished listening to. Dare to Oppose is about Morgan and Billy in our world. Dare to Prevail is the story of the other Morgan after she arrives back in her world. Those will be on audio eventually. Thanks for listening.